hit your spacebar to unmute, and then you are able to participate. But for now, I do have you all muted because we were getting a little bit of background noise. So I want to refresh your memory very quickly that last week, although we spent a lot of time talking about the fires in California and the Western United States more generally, and also we talked a little bit about what was happening in the election and climate change, we started a lecture series, and I'm going to concentrate there this week, and then maybe next week we'll talk a little bit more about what's happening in the campaign. But I do want to just let you know that from where I look, looking at polling data at both the national and the state level, looking at developments in the race, that there's a lot of noise, there's a lot going on in the campaign, but not a lot of movement in the polls, which means that Joe Biden continues to be favored to win this election, that Donald Trump has about a 1 in 4 chance of maybe eking out a narrow electoral college victory, as he did in 2016, and that the Democrats' prospects for either making significant gains or even getting control of the Senate continue to look good. And so that's all I'm going to say about the campaign and the horse race aspect of it in order to be able to make some headway this week on the lecture topic, Race and Justice in America in the 21st Century. And I'll just refresh your memory that I'm going to start with a historical overview of race and racism in America, and then transition into looking at legal and policy issues, then view things from the perspective of the contemporary social sciences, conclude the kind of survey of what's happening with race in America in the 21st century by complicating the picture, looking beyond the black-white historical axis and into the presence of Latinos and Asians and interracial persons, as well as Native Americans, in the what's sometimes called American racial pentagon. And then finally conclude with some discussion of justice and democracy, as well as the ethics of identity. Look at what we should be doing about race, having understood as well as we can why race remains a contentious issue in 21st century American politics. And so I'm going to now continue with the overview of race and racism in America. And I want to start with the indication of why we're talking about this right now. And to be clear, the events that we are witness to right now, and I shared this brutal image with you last week, the issue of the image of George Floyd having his life snuffed out, that we have seen on fairly endless loops in the media. The fact that George Floyd's death is one of literally hundreds at the hands of the police every year. The police killings of African Americans are as common today as lynchings of African Americans were in the Jim Crow South, and that this has spurred protests across the country. Sorry, my slides are a little unstable today, but that we've seen protests in tiny little towns and major cities and everything in between, thousands of them across the United States and frankly across the world since the death of George Floyd in May. And that this has been exacerbated or perhaps catalyzed by the coronavirus, and in several ways. On the one hand, the sheer fact that you've got so many people cooped up, as all of us are at this point, gives a certain energy to these protests. People are looking for something to do, and these protests came along as being important and an outlet at this moment. But it's also the case that, as we've seen, African Americans have been at the forefront of cases and deaths from the coronavirus, much higher rate of fatality than their proportion of the population. And that reflects the kind of work that they do, the kind of conditions that they live in as a result of their relative lack of income and wealth, as well as underlying health issues, which can also be traced back to issues of environmental and racial justice, right? And so the coronavirus has both amplified the protests and called into stark focus the injustice of race relations in the United States. Again, 3 times the rate of cases for African Americans and Latinos, and a larger proportion of the fatalities as well. So I also started to introduce you last week, and this is where I'm going to really focus in the first part of the lecture this week on issues of criminal justice. And of course, this is where the George Floyd protest focused initially. And so what we see is quite clearly, African Americans are much more likely to be killed by the police than white people. And that is not because they are more likely to be criminals or because they're more likely to be dangerous to the police. At least if we take the likelihood of being armed as one index of how likely you are to be dangerous to the police. In fact, white Americans are more likely to be armed than African Americans, but African Americans are 3 times as likely to be killed by the police. That's not the totality of the story. We'll get deeper into this, but one of the things that this data seems to reveal, and other research definitely reflects, is that police officers, and it's not only white police officers, I think we have to be clear at the outset about this. It's Black police officers, it's Latino police officers, see African Americans and Latinos as more of a threat than white Americans. And that's not because of their underlying criminality or the likelihood that they're armed. It has to do with our culture as much as anything, and the images that our culture presents us of danger. And as I said to you also last week, it is the case that this is not uniform across the United States. It varies considerably city by city and state by state, and that depends crucially on the kinds of policies that different cities and states have adopted. If we take a stark example here, Oklahoma versus Georgia, what we see is that despite the fact that in terms of their demographics as well as their crime rates, Oklahoma and Georgia are quite comparable as states. You're 6 times more likely to be killed by the police in Oklahoma than in Georgia if you're an African American person being apprehended by the police. And that reflects the fact that Oklahoma has not adopted any of the reforms that Georgia has adopted to try to limit police violence. These reforms, again, this is mainly review, are shown to be quite effective, right? Require officers to use other means before shooting, reduces fatality by 25%. That seems quite obvious, yet it is not uniformly adopted by police departments in the United States. Require all use of force to be reported, right? And so then there's a review process to make sure that the use of force was justified. Again, reduces deaths by 25%. Just that simple administrative procedure. Ban chokeholds and strangleholds. And this is growing in adoption throughout the United States. It reduces police fatalities by more than 20%. And then we get into, I think, the less obvious, but in a sense, more important kinds of reforms that will get us, I think, into not only less violence, but actually better police community relations, especially with regards to race. And this is obviously where we need to be headed in terms of policy. In too many areas in the United States, African American communities view the police as a hostile, occupying force. And frankly, the police know that they're viewed this way. And this is part of the reason that there's so much tension and such a propensity to violence, is that there are such bad police community relations. And I'm not suggesting that it's exclusively the responsibility of the police to address this, but that there are measures that the police can take that are justified by public safety, but also important in the project of creating better relations with the community. One of them is to have a use of force continuum. The basic idea here is that you start by trying to have a conversation. You then, if that's not working, move up, but not going directly for your gun or your taser, and that there are stages that you have to go through before you can use force, and particularly before you can use lethal force, and that reduces fatalities by 20%. De-escalation training, and we're going to get into this later in the course. We're actually going to discuss a book by the woman Jennifer Eberhardt, who really pioneered de-escalation training, extremely effective in reducing police fatalities. And this basically says, look, the police officer is in fear of the possibility that the person they're apprehending is a violent armed criminal. But it's also the case that the vast majority of the time that's not what's happening, and that the person being apprehended is also in fear that the police are going to use violence against them. And that's a situation that, just because of the mutual mistrust and fear, is likely to escalate. And there are simple things that the police officers can do to bring the tension level down. And when they do that, these interactions transform and become much more cooperative, much less likely to result in violence in either direction, right? And so again, this not only reduces the likelihood of death, it improves the relationship between the police and the community, starting with that direct interaction. And then there are other measures, for instance, a duty to intervene. If another officer uses excessive force, one of the things that's so disturbing about the George Floyd video is that Derek Chauvin, the police officer, has his knees on Mr. Floyd's neck for over 8 minutes. The other police officers are simply standing by, not doing anything. If there's a duty to intervene, then they are legally bound to say to Chauvin, you need to get off his neck. This is not justified, right? No shooting or restrictions on shooting at moving vehicles, give a warning before shooting. These are all things that could be done. And when these things are done, as they have been in Buffalo, New York, as you can see, it greatly reduces police violence. And to get now at some of the additional data, one of the things that I think has really prompted this most recent round of protest is the sense that the police are not accountable for what they do. And as you can see, if we take 100 cases, right, of police use of lethal violence, in 96% of those cases, the officers are not charged. In 99% of those cases, the officers are not convicted. And most people who study this believe that it's not the case that 99% of police violence is justified, that there's been a presumption on the part of prosecutors that the police are not going to be charged. That's in part because prosecutors depend on the police for building their cases. It's also the case that there's what's sometimes called the blue wall of silence. Police officers will not testify against each other, and there's a hesitation on the part of juries, as well as legal standards that prevent the police from being held accountable. And so if you are a member of a community that has a very high rate of police violence, and you feel like there's absolutely nothing you can do within the legal channels our society establishes for accountability. If somebody kills someone, there's supposed to be a legal process that determines whether or not that was a justified killing. If you believe that legal process is so skewed that you never get accountability, you can understand why the protests occur in the street. There is no path to justice within the institutions. The protest becomes extra institutional. We've seen a huge growth in the prison population in the United States, which has led many scholars to refer to a mass incarceration crisis in the United States. It's not just a police violence crisis, it's a crisis that is reflected in the fact that many African-American inner city communities have more African-American young men in jail than they have high school graduates, right? And this has not always been the case in the United States. Through a series of legal reforms that occurred in the late 70s and the early 1980s, so-called 3 strikes and you're out reform, which increased the mandatory sentencing with repeated felony convictions, the imposition of mandatory sentencing for low-level drug crimes, enhanced police enforcement in inner city African-American neighborhoods, the so-called war on drugs. All of this amounted to a vast increase in apprehension and prosecution for low-level, usually nonviolent drug crimes, and put a huge proportion of Americans in prison. America now has the highest rate of incarceration of any society in the world. We are worse than Russia. We are worse than apartheid South Africa was. We are a carceral nation, a nation that is putting its citizens in jail. And to be clear, the statistics here are very disproportionate. If you look at white Americans compared with African Americans, what you see is that African Americans are about 5 times more likely to be imprisoned as a proportion of their population than white Americans are, right? And so, again, not a justice system that appears to be racially just, because again, African Americans and white Americans generally commit crimes at around the same level, or to put it differently, engage in criminal conduct at around the same level. And part of what's going on here is that African Americans serve longer jail sentences for the same crime. For the most recent period that we have data, it's about 1/5 as long as white Americans, 20% more. And so part of the reason that you have so many more African Americans in jail is not only because more of them are being convicted, but because they're serving 20% more time than white Americans. They end up staying in jail longer, being a higher proportion of the prison population. And again, if you're Black as opposed to white, you're much more likely to be convicted of a crime, right? And so if it's murder, 7 times more likely. If it's a drug crime, 12 times more likely. This reflects access to good legal counsel. If you're wealthy, you get a private attorney. If not, you have a public defender. And public defenders are much more likely to engage in a plea bargain than are private attorneys. But it also reflects biases on the part of prosecutors, who are much more likely to go after an African American accused of a crime. There's a famous study in Minneapolis where a new chief prosecutor came in, looked at the data, saw that his department had gone off after African Americans 3 or 4 times more often than white Americans for the same crime, and directed all of their prosecutors to have the same level of prosecution for white Americans and Black Americans. 2 years later, they did a review, and despite the fact that they had fired prosecutors, hired new prosecutors, made this the policy of the department, the numbers were almost unchanged. They discovered that what they had to do was to actually use data on a month-by-month basis. Every month you get a report. How many whites accused of the same crime did you actually prosecute? How many Blacks? If it's not the same percentage, then you got to fix that in the coming month. And what that reflects, again, and this is the big category that we're going to be talking about when we get into the social science, is what's called implicit bias. You had liberal Black prosecutors in Minneapolis who were looking at white people and Black people who were accused of the same crime and essentially seeing them differently because of our cultural stereotypes. We're much more likely to think that the African American is guilty. We're much more likely to think that the African American is violent, a risk to society, if not prosecuted, right? And so those cultural stereotypes don't only affect the police at the street level, they reflect the prosecutors, they reflect what the juries do if they're likely to convict or find reasonable doubt. If they convict, how long a sentence they're likely to impose or a judge is likely to impose. This is a systemic problem in our criminal justice system, not just a problem with the police. And so we have seen some reform in the wake of the George Floyd protests, but I would suggest to you that the reform has been uneven and limited. This data, by the way, is a little bit old. I think there's been some more progress since this data was published. But again, if you look at all the gray boxes on this map, right? This is roughly speaking a map of the United States. You can see an awful lot of states where there's been no legislation. The pink boxes as well. The blue boxes as well. The pink boxes are states where there's currently some consideration, and the yellow boxes are states where there's actually been legislation. And as you can see, there are rather few states so far. So I now want to transition into the broader topic, not just injustice in the racial injustice in the criminal justice system, but injustice in our society as a whole. And I want to start out by pointing out what a polarizing issue this has become. And in a sense, this is unfortunately one of the major dividing issues between the parties right now. And that is reflected in what you might call the gap in perception of who faces discrimination. If you ask all voters, do African Americans face discrimination in the United States? About 60% say yes. But then when you look at the breakdown, about 3/4 of Democrats, but less than half of Republicans say yes. So the gap here is over 30% in perceptions of discrimination. And then if you jump down to, do whites face discrimination? About 20% of Americans say yes, but it's only about 10% and fully 25% of Republicans. And so there's a big gap in our perceptions of racial injustice in this society. And that is a problem. Now, one piece of good news here is that younger Republicans are beginning to change their minds about this, right? And so Republicans under 45, actually nearly 60% of them say African Americans face discrimination. Over 45, it's only a little bit more than a third. So there's almost a 20% gap within Republicans over whether or not African Americans face discrimination, depending upon the age. And again, you see a different gap with regards to whether or not whites face discrimination, which is interesting and a little hard to reconcile with the other data. So when we look at what's happening with the division between Democrats and Republicans, what we see again is something very strange, or at least I think very disturbing. White Democrats have changed their minds about whether or not they have favorable attitudes to movements like the Black Lives Matter movement. And as you can see, the Black area here represents negative views of African Americans, especially African American political claim making in politics. And you can see in 2012, that was quite high. But by the time you get to 2016, it's diminished substantially, right? From about 28% of the Democratic electorate to less than 20% of the Democratic electorate. And the portion of the Democratic electorate that is sympathetic to African Americans and their claims for racial justice in our society has doubled from 2012 to 2016. It appears these trends are continuing, and that probably Donald Trump is responsible for making Democrats more sympathetic to the idea of the claims for justice and redress on the part of African Americans. Yet if you look at Republicans, essentially in 2012 and 2016, they look exactly the same, right? Almost no changes. And so again, we're having a major partisan split on these issues. This is also true with immigration. I won't go into the details on immigration here today. And so just to get a sense of what's happening with the partisan divide in our country and the discrepancy in partisan perceptions, I just can't resist showing you this diagram. And so this is about perceptions of how the economy is doing. And if you look in 2016 at how Republicans think the economy is doing, the perception on the part of Republicans until the election of Donald Trump was that the economy was not doing very well. And then when Trump took office, you can see Republican approval of the economy went through the roof. And I just want to be clear. The economy did actually get better in 2018. But the thing driving Republicans' change in perception of how the economy is doing occurred before any improvement in the economic situation. It is the election of Donald Trump. I mean, if you look November 2016 to early 2017, when Trump is sworn in, to late 2017, these perceptions radically shift. And by the way, the Democrats also show a downward trend in how they think the economy is doing in 2018 and 2019, despite the fact that the economy is actually doing quite well, at least in terms of the macro metrics over that period. What has changed is not so much the economy, but the leadership, right? And so this reflects the degree to which our perceptions of political reality are now shaped by our partisan identity. And that is obviously something that is then very relevant to what's happening with race in the United States today. I'm going to just briefly introduce you, and we've talked a little bit about this in the past, to some current research which I find to be deeply disturbing. This is by a man, Larry Bartels, professor at Vanderbilt University, author of multiple influential books, and he recently did a study in which, and again, this is stuff we've talked about together recently. I'm going to be relatively quick about it. Attitudes about lawlessness and their correlation to ethnic antagonism, right? And so he asked these 4 questions. The traditional American way of life is disappearing so fast that we may have to use force to save it. And he asked these questions of Republican and Republican-leaning voters. And what he found is essentially 50% approved of this idea that we may have to use force to preserve the traditional American way of life, and only 6% disagreed with this. Patriotic Americans may have to take the law into their own hands. Over 40% agreed. Less than 10% disagreed. Strong leaders have to bend the rules to get things done. 45% agreed, 6.1% disagreed. It's hard to trust elections because so many people will vote for anyone who offers them a handout. 75% of the Republicans he surveyed agreed with this, less than 3% disagreed. And what I want to point out is that Bartels found a very straightforward correlation between what's called ethnic antagonism, basically having negative views of Latinos and African Americans, and the attitudes that I just discussed with you, that you might have to take the law into your own hands, that strong leaders should bend the rules, that it's hard to trust elections. Very strong correlation. So what you can see down here is the people with negative scores don't have a lot of ethnic antagonism, and they don't score very high on those signs of erosion of democratic norms. But the people who have strongly anti-Black attitudes, ethnic antagonistic attitudes, score much more highly. And there's a simple, I think, explanation to this, which is the United States is becoming more and more a multiracial democracy. Whites are on their way to being a minority in our society. Blacks, Latinos, and Asians combined will become a majority within the next 20 years. And white Americans who do not like the growing power of racial minorities recognize that that power comes through democracy, through their increased share of citizenship of the vote, and hence their increased representation in institutions of power in our society. And so, unfortunately, a significant portion of right-leaning white Americans are withdrawing some of their support for democracy. And this is, it seems to me, particularly disturbing indication of what's happening in race relations in the United States. I'm going to not drill down on this too much. You know what? I think actually, let me do something else. let me pause for a minute because I've just thrown a lot of information at you. I want to make sure, does anybody have a question or something that you would like to discuss before I move into what I'm going to do next is really look at the socioeconomic data on racial inequality in the United States. Anybody want to talk about the criminal justice issues or the issues to do with the perception of racial justice and the way in which it tends to break down along partisan lines before we get into the socioeconomic issues? All right, Marjorie, give me one moment. I'm going to unmute you, and then you are probably going to have to unmute yourself by holding your space bar down. Go ahead.
This is Peter.
Hi, Peter. Go ahead.
You know, we're talking about perception. You see in the news every day these pictures of somebody assaulting someone else. You know, and invariably they're people of color. It would appear that people of color are committing more crimes than the non. Right? I'm not trying to sound racist, but it's what I see on television almost every single day.
Yeah, Peter, and I will be talking about this a little bit in a couple weeks, but you're absolutely right, which is to say that there are two things that are problematic about local news coverage when it comes to issues of criminality and racial justice. And so I showed you that huge increase in the level of people imprisoned in the United States, right? And what's really distressing about that diagram is that over that same period in which we've seen roughly a tenfold increase in the level of imprisonment in the United States, we've seen crimes come down by more than 50%, right? So the rate of crime has decreased dramatically in the United States over the last quarter century. However, if you analyze the local news and you pay attention to, first of all, how much time they spend on crime, and second of all, how close to the beginning of the newscast they put the crime coverage, what you see is that crime coverage has either stayed constant or actually increased, and that it is more regularly highlighted. It's put close to the beginning of the news, right? And so our news gives us the impression that the crime rate is higher than it is. And by the way, when you do surveys of people and you ask them how high do you think the crime rate is in your neighborhood, the average American is way off. They think the crime rate is 10 to 14 times as high as it actually is. So first of all, our perceptions of crime are off because our coverage of crime is off in the news. Second of all, again, when we analyze this, when we look at all the newscasts in the United States, compare Black and white crime rates with the coverage of crimes by Black and white people, we see a sharp discrepancy, right? Black and white people commit crimes generally at a similar level, right? And Blacks are only 13% of the population. They're committing roughly 13% of the crimes in most categories. Whites, who are 60 to 70% of the population, are committing 60 to 70% of the crimes, right? But when you look at the coverage on the news, it's almost the inverse, right? Yeah. 60% of the coverage of crimes is of Black people or people of color committing crimes on the local news, despite the fact that it's only about 10 or 15 or 20% of the crimes being committed. And there's a reason for this, which is that it generates ratings, viewership, commercial advertising revenue for these stations. But there's a perverse consequence of this, which is that our perceptions of crime are skewed, So you're absolutely right, Peter. That when you watch the news, you get a picture that is very different from the picture I just presented you, right? And the people who have studied this know this, and you know, it'd be interesting to see if the one of the future causes of Black Lives Matter would be to try to tackle this issue in local news coverage of crime. Thank you for the good question, Peter. Marjorie, were you also trying to ask a question? I think you're going to need to hold your spacebar down or push your unmute button. I'm trying to unmute you, but I can't. I think it's on your end. There you go. Good.
No, I was thinking about what you were saying about the economy. Was some of that based on the Republicans mainly, I think, or individuals looking at the stock market going up and the income taxes going down, presumably, just certain areas, and they're basing that on their attitude toward where the economy stands, because people are not, the majority of people are not spending money.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I'll point out to you that 50% of the stocks owned in the United States are owned by 1% of the population, right? And so you know, when we concentrate on the stock market, and I don't know about you, my retirement income is invested in the stock market. It does matter to me. I don't think I'm one of those 1% who owns a large share, but 50% of Americans do have some stock ownership, but that means 50% don't. And you know, the fact that 50% is owned by 1% means that the rest of us in the remaining 49% don't own that much. But Marjorie, I do want to show you just for a moment something that I think is important here, and that is, so when do Republicans' perceptions of Donald Trump start, or I'm sorry, of the economy start improving? And what we see is that they improve dramatically from November 2016 through June 2016. If you remember, the tax reform bill is not passed until November of 2018. And it doesn't really take effect until 2018, 2019, right? And so the perceptions, I don't think, are being driven exclusively. And we could map the stock market against this as well, and that would make it a little bit more interesting to try to discern. I think really, though, what is driving the perception, the rapid change in the perception of how the economy is doing, with Republicans thinking it's doing much better as soon as Donald Trump is elected, Democrats becoming much more sour on the economy as soon as Barack Obama is out of office. It is a partisan perception. It may have some basis in reality, but I think it's really rooted in the fact that my guy's in charge. Everything must be all right. Oh, shoot, my guy's out of office. Now the sky is falling, right? Unfortunately, our perceptions of political reality are deeply shaped by our partisan identities in ways that clearly distort what we're seeing. Thank you, Marjorie. Anybody else with the question at this point? All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and mute everyone again. And if you got a question, hold the spacebar down and ask it to me. I will not be able to see that you have a question when I get back into the slides, but I do want to take your questions as soon as they occur, okay? So let me get back into the presentation, and I now want to focus on the underlying socioeconomic reality. And I'm not going to try to take you through this chart, although this chart does show, and it's a little bit difficult to see, that there have been some notable improvements in how African Americans are doing in our society between the late 1960s and the current historical period. Improvements in college education levels, in rates of poverty. And so that the civil rights reforms of the 1960s and affirmative action, the welfare reform that Johnson brought about with the Great Society program have had an impact. And I think that's important to bear in mind when we then look at something like this. And this, I think, is the single most important indication of racial inequality in the United States today. This is the wealth gap, right? The average white American family has around $170,000 in wealth. The average Black family has around $17,500 in wealth. That means there's about 10 times more net worth, right? To be clear, this is not income. This is not how much you're making a year. The way you get the net worth is by counting all your assets, subtracting all your debt, and figuring out how much wealth you have, right? How much is your home worth? How much is your stock portfolio worth? Do you have a second home? Do you have automobiles that have a significant amount of value in them, etc.? Versus what's your credit card debt? What's your school loan debt? What's your mortgage, right? And when you do that calculus, what you see is that white Americans are much wealthier than African Americans. And if we look at this historically, what we see is that over the last 40 to 50 years, in a sense, this has gotten worse. It's not gotten better, right? So when we look at white wealth, right, it has increased substantially. When we look at African American wealth, which is the red line down here, Hispanic wealth is the green line, it has gotten better, but it has not gotten better relative to white wealth, right? And so the gap as a ratio, white wealth to Black wealth, has either remained very stable or in fact gotten a little bit worse in the period in which we've seen the civil rights legislation and some gains. And so I now want to spend a little bit more time asking what accounts for that wealth gap. And here I want to be clear that most of the places that you might think that it would come from don't actually do a very good job explaining it. So if you thought, for instance, that it came from discrepancies in education, what you would see is, yes, that's important, but it's not actually the main explanatory variable, right? So even if you just look at people who have less than a high school education, white people with less than a high school education have 40 times as much wealth as Black people without a high school education. If we move up and look at people with some college education, white people with some college education and Black people with some college education, there's almost a 10 times discrepancy, right? And so across the board, what we see is that this is not just correlated with education. Even with the same education level, whites have much more wealth than Blacks. Similarly, it's not to do with employment status, right? Whites and Blacks who are employed full-time, there's almost a 14 times wealth gap between them. Whites and Blacks who are out of the labor market currently, there's a 60 times gap between them, right? And between people who are unemployed, there's almost a 50 times. Whites have 50 times more wealth than Blacks who are unemployed. So again, it's not employment, it's not education. By the way, it's not income either. And this, I think, is very important. For whites and Blacks who are earning more or less the same amount of money, it's still the case that there's a big wealth gap, right? With whites and blacks who are earning 25 to 50,000 a year, that wealth gap is 10 times. With whites and blacks who are earning between 75 and 120,000 a year, it's about a 3 times wealth gap. So sometimes income helps, but it doesn't eliminate the wealth gap, even for people who are earning more than $120,000 a year. Home ownership also doesn't account for the wealth gap, right? If you look at blacks who own homes and white who own homes, right, it's still the case that whites are 2.5 times as wealthy as blacks, even the blacks who own homes, if you compare whites who own homes. And we could keep going, right, looking at education and income and marriage status, despite, right, there being an ability to compare apples and apples. When we look at black people and white people who have a bachelor's degree, who have high income and who are married, right? You know, that should be the group that's doing best. Guess what? There's still basically more than twice as much wealth for white Americans as there is for black Americans. And let me just say for a moment why that is. And I will get into the income differences in just a moment. But the big difference here is inherited wealth. Whites inherit much more wealth than blacks do, and that reflects intergenerational inequality, right? The reason whites inherit more wealth is because their families have more wealth, and that goes back generation after generation after generation. And there's lots of good sociological research that indicates when you have more wealth, that not only is transmitted across generations, it is amplified across generations. When you have more wealth, you can assist your children in acquiring the education and qualifications they need to have better careers, to get more income and to get more wealth. When you have more wealth, you can shelter or protect your children from stresses that have been shown to interfere with employment and wealth creation when they become adults. If you have hunger or housing insecurity, it typically is the case that actually creates psychological trauma for the children, and that interferes with their capacity to do well in school and with their capacity to earn later in life. And perhaps most importantly, if you come from a family with wealth, not only are you going to inherit wealth, right, once the older generation passes, but even before they pass, they're much more likely to assist you in purchasing a home or affording an education, in taking the steps that are wealth-creating steps while they're still alive and you're early in your life process. What we see in the statistics on home ownership is about 2/3 of people who purchase new homes in the United States don't just get a bank loan and a mortgage, they get assistance from family members in purchasing the home, especially the down payment, right? And so they're able to purchase a home earlier, they're able to get out of the rental trap earlier, in which a significant portion of their income is going to rent. And so they get into the situation of getting equity. And owning a home is in a sense a mechanism of forced savings. It also clearly has advantages in terms of taxation. The mortgage interest is deductible from your taxes, and for many people that's a savings of $10,000 or $20,000 a year, and that means that they can save more, invest more in their children. And so just to be as clear as possible about this, African Americans, many of them are the descendants of slaves, right? These are people who were not able to accumulate wealth because they were owned by other people, because it was illegal for them to own property. After the abolition of slavery in the Jim Crow period, there was systematic theft and violence exercised in the South, where the vast majority of African Americans lived until the middle of the 20th century, to prevent African Americans from accumulating wealth and property ownership. And so this is one of those legacies of historical injustice, which is very clearly reflected in current data. Why don't, again, I stop there and just ask for your comments. We are very close to being out of time. And that was the central point I wanted to make about socioeconomic inequality in the United States today. It's reflected in wealth inequality. And there's a history to be told about where that wealth inequality comes from, and lots of data to demonstrate that it doesn't come from any place else. I'm going to unmute everyone. I would love to hear your questions or your comments. Anybody from the atrium? Okay, Fran, go ahead.
I find all of that very interesting. But when we talk about inequality, it's not only the Blacks we're talking about, and particularly in the sense of income. And I'm talking mainly about women earnings versus men. So all of this is very interesting, but it can be applied to other groups.
Thank you, Fran, and you're 100% right. And
you always say that.
Well, then you're batting 1,000.
Right.
So let me say two things to you. First of all, you're 100% correct that there's a stubborn discrepancy between what women earn and what men earn in the United States. The second thing I will say is that there is a stubborn discrepancy between what Blacks earn and what whites earn, and it's worse than the gender discrepancy, just to be clear. Third thing is that white women typically marry white men, and African American women don't typically marry white men. Right, and so the marriage picture with African Americans is a little bit more complicated, but that in a sense, many white women overcome aspects of the gender income discrepancy through their partners, right, through their spouses. It's not fair. It's not the way it should be. It creates inequality within the marriage. It leads to putting more emphasis on the man's career. There's strong reasons to be critical of the gender wage gap, but it's also important to see when we look at that wealth gap, right? That's between families. And there's a reason we collect the data on the family level, because most people have the two-income family, and the result is that what's actually striking, Black women earn more than Black men do, right? And so what happens in white families, which is that the white man earns more and so compensates for the lack of earnings, doesn't happen with the Black families. And that's part of the reason that I focus there today. It's also obviously the case that this is a lecture series on racial inequality, because that's what's being protested in the streets right now. But having said all that, I do absolutely want to acknowledge your point. You're 100% correct. And, you know, topic for another lecture series, why is there such a stubborn income gap for women in our society? It's important as well. Thank you. Anyone else with a comment or a question today? All right. Well, so I'm going to say so long. I will see you next week. please continue to be well and take care of yourselves. I hope everybody got their flu shot, and I will see you next week. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.